I had achieved a lot, traveled and lectured all over the world. You know, I was taught scientific method. I was taught to analyze. I was taught to evaluate everything I read. Everything had to be logical. There are certain things that just you can't figure out. I was born in Montreal into a Jewish family. My grandparents had immigrated from Russia. My dad was in the Canadian Air Force, and he was with the Canadian and British forces when they liberated Bergen-Belsen. I identified very, very strongly with being Jewish, but not religious. I did have a bar mitzvah, went through the public school system in Montreal, went to McGill University, and then, as any Jewish mother would want, became a doctor. Established a practice, taught, and I lived there very comfortably for, very successfully for a long time, expecting nothing more than to stay there for the rest of my life, until things really started to turn sour in Quebec, and with anti-Semitism and other things that were going on. My grandfather, my mother's father, nicest man, kind heart, he had walked into the post office, he needed to mail a letter, and they refused to speak to him. I remember him in our kitchen in tears. It just didn't sit well with me. I decided that's not where I wanted to live, not where I wanted to raise a family. Picked up, left Montreal, and ended up in the Bible Belt in Texas. Well, I found myself down in Dallas, bought a practice. I was introduced to the staff. One woman in particular stands out, and she walked over and she said, "So tell me about yourself." I was very wrapped up in myself at that time. I had achieved a lot, traveled and lectured all over the world. Religion really wasn't part of my life. I wasn't used to people basing their lives on religion. I wasn't used to people with spiritual backgrounds, and that was her. There was something about her. There was a peace, there was a solidity, something that she had in her that I didn't have. Jesus was some concept that I knew that Christians ascribed to that was out there. But as far as I was concerned, I was Jewish, I was doing what I was on my own path. The more she told me about Jesus, about God, the more I started to understand that this is something that I probably needed. Setting up a new life in a strange city at that stage in my life was a major challenge. And I was fearful, and I was apprehensive, and there were a lot of things that I was struggling with in trying to get myself established. And yet there was this rock that she stood firmly on, and it was something that I really felt that I needed as well. And at one point she actually asked me, she says, "Don't you think you should give God credit for some of the things that you've accomplished?" And I very seriously thought about it for a little bit, and I said, well, I suppose I could give God some of the credit. Dawn and I were married in 2010, and for our first anniversary, after some back and forth, we decided that we would go to Israel. The gentleman who was actually our tour leader was he was a Messianic Jew, had grown up in a traditional home, much like I had, and he took us from site to site and described everything really in a Jewish context. Everything was relating to the Bible, everything was relating to Jesus. More and more of it started to register. It started to become real. We were at the Western Wall, and as I started to pray, this overwhelming presence enveloped me. It was a heat, it was a pressure, it was like somebody had his arms around me. I heard a voice. "You're home. I've brought you back where you belong. You're safe." I felt just a tremendous, tremendous sense of peace, a tremendous sense of rest. And I was convinced, there was no question that this was a very real experience for me. But you need to, as a Jew, we had always been brought up to believe that, if you're going to be Jewish, you cannot believe in Jesus, you cannot believe in Yeshua. And so I went to our tour leader that morning, and I asked him, I said, "I have some questions for you," because he had grown up in a traditional Jewish home, and now here he was a believer and a Messianic Jew, and I needed to know how do you do this? When he explained to me that you can believe, you can accept Jesus as your Messiah, and doing so doesn't mean that you have to relinquish being Jewish. You do not have to give up being Jewish in order to believe. It was literally like somebody turned on a light switch. On that Friday night, which happened to have been the first night of Purim, of all the places to be saved, I mean, if you wrote a script for that, I can't think of any better place that I would like to have been. I accepted Yeshua. I accepted Jesus as my Messiah. I looked at Donna and say, like, I've got it too. I'm standing on that same rock that she was standing on. So it's not just the two of us. It's the two of us and Yeshua as well.